vine training and pruning that are carried on in California, and of course there are modifications of each, as we will see a little later this morning on cane pruning. We got through the head training, spur pruning, and the cordon trained spur pruning last time. And I said you should know something of the advantages and disadvantages and varieties which might be used with each. And then we got up to this point of head trained cane pruning, which is the topic for this morning. Head trained, that means the arms and the old wood are essentially in a head, but then we cane, and I think I have to put in here, and I'll explain why, and spur pruning, because you cannot have cane pruning as a continuous system without having some spurs along with it. And I said that before we got into that, we had to stop and discuss something which has been covered in the text, and that is this matter of what we refer to as some more definitions, and that is what we call pruning units, and fruiting units. And here's a very good example of both pruning units and fruiting units. And the fruiting units in this case would be the canes, and the spurs would be referred to probably as the pruning units, as we'll get into. So that regardless of which of these types of training and pruning we're going to carry on, we prune off all of this new growth except for one of three purposes. And one is this fruiting unit or bearing unit, as I call it fruiting unit or bearing unit. And the bearing unit, let's put that bearing unit instead of, no, I like fruiting unit better. It can be spurs or canes. And the spurs in turn then, as you found out in lab already, can be short, which is what we refer to as a 1+ bud. They can be the medium or usual, which is a usual 2-bud spur, 2 or 2+. And then occasionally we have the long spur with certain varieties which we go 3, maybe 4 buds. And usually anything beyond that would be called a short cane. And on these short spur types, which we, as I say, we pruned one of them in class. A good example of a very short spur would be Cardinal, which you did prune in class, and one of its parents, Revere. And these are pruned, as you were told, to very short buds, even though they're table fruit, even though you get much better fruit if you have lots of leaves early in the season in comparison to the number of clusters, to give you a good leaf to cluster ratio. The point is that commercially, Cardinal and Revere are so extremely fruitful on these buds. That is, they'll put out usually an average of 2 shoots per bud out of that 3-bud growing point I told you about. And usually these will have an average of 2 clusters apiece. So out of a given bud, on an average, you'll pick up about 4 clusters. And if you left 2 or 3 buds on those, you'd spend a terrific amount of money in thinning the fruit. So even though we know that in your backyard you can still get better fruit if you prune Cardinal Revere to something like 2 or 3 buds and then thin it severely, you can't afford to do that on 160 acres. So that is the main reason for pruning those 2 varieties to a very short bud. Now, where do we come in with the long buds? This comes in with varieties such as Emperor, or what we refer referred to as white Malaga, although Malaga is a term over the world. And if you're going to grow Muscat of Alexandria for table fruit, or even for maximum crop, Muscat of Alexandria perhaps should be pruned to long buds. You can hardly afford, again, since it's still considered a wine grape, you can hardly afford to cane prune it. Yet at least, I think the time may come when we could do this, but I think the price today is still such that you cannot afford to cane prune it, which you should do, and then cluster thin it, or flower cluster thin it. So those varieties are examples of what we refer to as long bud pruning, and everything else would fall into this medium category. All the other spur prune wine varieties and table type varieties. Okay, the other type of bearing unit is canes. And here we would obviously then break it down again into short canes, which may be only 5 to 8 buds long, and our regular length canes, which are 8 to 15, or which is recommended 8 to 15 buds, but often 8 to 20 buds, especially for Thompson seedless. Those would be the fruiting canes then on certain varieties. We do not use the short cane, the 5 to 8 bud cane, very much in California. It's used a lot in the world, but it's a sort of an impractical unit length to carry on in California. A spur up to 3 buds or so can carry the fruit without having to have support for the spur. But when you get up to 5 or 8 buds, that'd help with. You have to tell me that every day. I'm not used to this TV bit. When you get up to a spur, if you want to call it that, 5 to 8 buds long, it's too short to tie, and yet may carry too much fruit without being tied to some support. So it becomes a sort of a unmanageable unit under most conditions. We do use it a little bit for 1 or 2 very unimportant varieties. Some people might say they're not unimportant. Malvasia bianca. I have no idea how much acreage it is, but it can't be more than 500 to 1,000 acres. But it is a very large clustered variety that has some problem with fruiting on basal buds. So if you left long canes on it, it's weak enough so that it would overcrop rather quickly. On the other hand, if you don't leave at least the short canes on it, you may not get enough crop to make it commercially important. So short cane then, so far as California industry, is more or less out. So it's the 3 bud lengths, very short, normal, and the long buds, 3 to 4 buds, and the regular cane length of anywhere from 8 to 15 preferred, 8 to 20 more commonly seen. Those are the fruiting units. Regardless of whether we have overhead arbor, vertical cordon, or cane prune, as we're going into here. But we have the other pruning units, which are broken down into, and this really becomes a problem sometimes for students to get it straight, that we have renewal spurs, and replacement spurs. And these are still spurs, and they may still be only 1, 2 buds or so long, but you leave them for 2 completely and entirely different reasons. A renewal spur is left to renew your fruiting wood. So a renewal spur then is left almost always, or always, with, it's associated with cane pruning. So renewal spur, these are intimately linked. And that's why I said cane and spur here, until you had to explain why. This happens to be then cane and you might put this in your notes too, Renewal spur. It is not a fruiting unit. It is not intended to be a fruiting unit. It is intended to produce a couple of good canes to renew your fruiting wood in the cane prune system for next year. Now, every year for 15 years, I've asked this on an exam, and every year for 15 years, about 3/4 of the class misses it. Let's see how many miss it this time. Why do we need renewal spurs with cane pruning and do not need it with the head train spur prune systems? In the spur prune system, let's use the cordon, that's the easiest. You got an arm here, and let's just make it simple. You leave a 2-bud spur because these basal buds are very fruitful. And you can get all the crop you want off of pruning back to 2-bud spurs. And this will go out and produce you a good long shoot and carry, on an average, 2 clusters. I say on an average. It'll carry 2 clusters of fruit. I'm going to try to make it real simple this time and see if we can't get this concept across. So you make, with this shoot then, with all this reserved food behind it, and only 2 buds off this spur, can grow out and make a very satisfactory wood growth and at the same time carry its 2 bunches of fruit. And this one can do the same thing. So that next year, when you come back to prune, all you got to do is throw away this one, cut it off here, and under normal conditions, this is matured into a very nice cane because it didn't have a whole lot of work to do. Remember, the capacity gets down to that individual cane, and capacity equals fruit plus wood growth, or shoot growth. So with a fairly low light of fruit, relatively speaking, you got 2 clusters, you should get good wood growth. So then this becomes a properly matured cane for next year's fruit, and you can cut that end off after it's produced as 2 clusters, and you have no need for a renewal spur because the actual fruiting spur itself becomes next year's fruiting wood because it matured up properly enough so that it could produce those 2 clusters and still make a good matured cane. Okay, so that we can, I can't get used to this flat room that we're in that half the time my back's to half the class. Okay, now let's assume, maybe I'll sit on the floor and use a pointer. Now let's assume, to speed things up a little bit, that we're talking about a cane prune vine. And we've got, instead of leaving that 2-bud spur, we're going to leave a 15-bud spur. So we're going to leave 15 buds on this cane. And out of those 15, on an average, you got to figure at least half of them will push. So suppose you got 8 fruitful buds that push. Buds push or grow. They push or grow. And once again, each one of these buds, just like the 2-bud spur sitting over here that we illustrated before, each of these 8 fruitful buds should carry a couple of clusters. So coming out of this spur here and going through this 1-year-old cane, you have got to care for not 2 clusters of fruit, but 8 times 2, or 16 clusters of fruit. Now, if you produce 16 clusters of fruit on this cane, do you think that these shoots that come off down here are going to be long enough and strong enough to give you a 15-bud cane next year? Because you're paying for it here, you're taking it off in fruit. So the wood growth at these basal positions under most average conditions is not going to be strong enough, matured well enough or long enough to give you a good 15 bud cane next year. So what are you going to do about it? Well, what you have to do is prepare renewal spurs. So at the base of this thing, then let's go back now and put it in the way it really is. Take this example here as it should be. Here's the arm, and you come out and you had a renewal spur, which is 2 buds long. And renewal spur should be 2 buds long. Now, this is the year before. And along with this, you've got this cane coming out here, see, that carried all this fruit. Let me just correct this drawing a little bit here. This was a 2 bud spur the year before. And you had a cane out here on somebody's foot. This is this fruiting cane that we're talking about here. So behind it, we have to leave. Now this is not going to produce good wood because of the heavy load of fruit. But behind it, we can leave a 2 bud spur, which with very little fruit load on it, should once again make 2 nice strong canes. Because even if they fruit, see, this is Thompson seedless, and basal buds aren't usually very fruitful, so usually they'll only have maybe 1 cluster each anyway. But whatever variety we're talking about, with only 2 buds feeding off of here, you make 2 nice strong shoots, well matured and with a little fruit on them. Your fruit's over here. And this is your renewal spur. The renewal spur we're talking about to renew the wood for next year. And it should produce, say, a couple of good canes. Then next year, you've worked this poor thing to death. Remember in one of my earlier lectures, I said if you've got a vineyard that the freeway is going to take, fruit it to its maximum capacity, weaken it, because you're going to pull it out anyway. Well, in essence, that's what you're doing here. We fruited this cane beyond its capacity, so we're going to throw it away. Cut it off and throw it away. Then that leaves us this situation. And what we'll do here is to keep this one for fruit, since it will be thrown away next year and therefore extends this framework the minimum distance. So we'll leave that for fruit for the next year, and once again cut this one back to 2 buds to give us this renewal spur for the succeeding year, which in turn will produce 2 long shoots. This one will fruit. This comes off the next year. You've extended the length of your head of your vine, the minimum distance, and it's just an alternation year by year by year. By leaving a cane, or leaving a 2 bud renewal spur, and then when those shoots grow, if they grow normally, keeping the terminal one the next year for fruit and cutting the basal one back to 2 buds to give you 2 strong shoots. Again, just to go through this again, the next year this will produce 2 strong shoots. This will fruit. We'll cut it off, as I say, and throw it away. We'll keep this terminal one for fruiting. We'll cut this basal one back into the head of the vine, back to 2 buds once again.
What do you do if only one pushes?
Well, that's why you leave enough. If only one pushes, and you'll find that this happens about a third or fourth of the time out there, you're going to pick up some well-matured water sprouts, or occasionally, even with this big speech I just gave you about this not producing any strong laterals while it's carrying all this fruit, sometimes there won't be 16 clusters on this. There may only be 5 or 6, and this one will grow out and be a good strong one. And that brings up the second reason you've got to know why you leave renewal spurs. Suppose you did this. Well, let me exaggerate it a little bit. Let's suppose that one didn't. Let's suppose this one out here did. And you didn't have enough of these because of what he said. They didn't do this idealistically. They didn't do what they were told. And you have to reach out and pick this one up and use it. The next year, this becomes part of the trunk of the vine. You can see what will happen in just a few years. The whole neat, compact head of the vine, which we show you in these idealistic slides, becomes sprawling and completely out of shape. You lose control of the shape of the vine if you have to use a lot of laterals off of canes in order to pick up satisfactory fruiting wood. Sound like a station just asked that question, doesn't it? But anyway, that's the situation. So you have to leave on cane pruned vines, you have to leave renewal spurs in order to pick up vigorous, good wood for the next year's fruiting canes, since you're fruiting this year's cane so heavily. And the other reason is if you do not do that and just rely on picking up laterals that do happen by chance to grow out strong enough to fruit it, you're going to ruin the shape of the vine. And this is why when you go down the valley from here to Bakersfield and look at a lot of these vines, they look horrible. Looking at them right now with all the leaves off and pruned back, you'll see a lot of instead of the head of the vine being a nice, neat, compact vine like this, that if you look down on the top of it, looks star-shaped and so forth. Wait a minute, I shouldn't say that because we're talking about cane pruned vines. And you look and see a head of the vine that only occupies about a foot of the row direction, and the cane's coming neatly off of it. You're going to find all sorts of messy looking things because growers just cannot seem to get around to the idea that they ought to leave renewal spurs in the cane pruning system. Now you can get by with this in some vigorous vineyards, and you can get by without leaving them in some young vigorous vineyards where you still have lots of latent buds which are not so deeply embedded, but what they will push out and give you lots of good healthy water sprouts in those first few years. But as the vine gets older, those water sprouts that might have latent buds which might have pushed that were in close to the head of the vine get increasingly covered up, and the latent buds that are going to push become fewer and fewer, and you're going to depend on more and more of this type of thing. Now I waxed on that about 5 minutes longer than I should, but it seems that it's one of the hardest concepts for the students to understand, at least in the answers we get back in exams. So we have the cane pruning. As I say, the only real difference between it and a head-trained spur prune vine is this fruiting unit, plus the fact that you have to have the renewal spur as a backup insurance for next year's fruiting wood. Then we get to the other type, and there's three types, of course: fruiting wood, renewal spurs, and replacement spur. I put it on here, I'll put it back now. And a replacement spur, you've all run into it already, is where you want to rebuild an arm for some reason. Remember those crazy vines I showed you last time where they got so long they had to tie them up with strings and so on? If they had used replacement spurs to replace or shorten the arms on those, then they would have been all right. So replacement spur is used to replace an arm that has gotten too long, or one that's been broken off for some reason, or is not well located when you're still adjusting the improvement of the shape of the old wood of the vine. So it has to do with the framework of the vine. It has nothing to do with this idea of replacing the fruiting wood. It's to maintain the shape of the vine. And you've done that out in the when you're pruning these cardinals. And we made a big point that one of the advantages, or the big advantage of cordon, is to have all the fruiting wood in these arms about the same height. But you were finding some that were getting too long. This is the old wood now. The spurs are up here. So you were leaving 2 buds fruiting spurs, or 1 plus on some of these, and then you were occasionally picking up a water sprout down in here somewhere to leave as a replacement spur. So that next year, this being left to 1 bud, it would grow out quite vigorously. You could fruit this year. Next year you could cut this off, and you have replaced the arm, shortened the arm, and once again you're back to trying to control the height. And next year you might take it off of this one, so that you work at it constantly to maintain this head, the terminal height of these arms and spurs at more or less a uniform level. That's a replacement spur. You can do the same thing on a head-trained vine. If a tractor knocks off 1 branch, or if it gets too high like you saw in those toquets and so on, to shorten those. Now perhaps the final thought on this. Now you have got to get in your minds clear the difference between a renewal spur, which is to renew the fruiting wood, and a replacement spur, which is to replace an arm. either to shorten it or to adjust it or to fill in a gap or something. And a renewal spur, if you stop to think about it, renewal spurs should usually be left to 2 buds for just this business that I just went through in great detail here. One of them is going to be next year's cane, and 1 bud is going to be next year's renewal spur. So renewal spurs are traditionally and commonly cut to 2 buds. But a replacement spur, in which all you want is 1 good vigorous shoot, are traditionally cut to just 1 bud, because you want good vigorous growth out of there to give you a good solid replacement for next year. Okay, now that's enough now on all the units. I guess we can go on now with cane pruning, get back to sort of the pattern we're following before on advantage, disadvantage, and so forth. The advantages, of course, to some of you are quite obvious. In California, it's extremely important because it's required, if you want to make a commercial crop, for varieties which do not normally have fruitful basal buds. And 2 of the most important varieties in the United States fall into that category. Thompson Seedless, of course, which makes up half our acreage, or it used to, now it makes about 40% perhaps, does not have enough fruit in those basal 2 or 3 buds in order to make a commercial crop. Now I emphasize that because we used to just say that Thompson Seedless did not have fruitful basal buds, and the first 105 class that goes out walks over to a Thompson and sees fruit on the renewal spur, on this little renewal spur down here, and they'll say, well, that's contrary to what we were told. What you'll find out when we get into it a little more detail, and I'll repeat this later on, is that this is a Thompson Seedless cane out to, say, 16 buds. You may average in this first quarter section here maybe a half a cluster per bud in positions 1 to 4. 1.5 cluster per bud. Out in here from 4 to about 12, in this half section here, you're going to average about 1.5 clusters. And then out here you drop back again to about a half a cluster. So it's in this midsection from about 4 to position 8 or 12 that you want to get your maximum crop in Thompson Seedless. And then the other reason, of course, for which most of this class is involved in is you need it for good maximum crops on varieties with small clusters. You need cane pruning with varieties with small clusters, even though the basal buds may be quite fruitful. And the varieties are such as the ones that you're interested in. All of these $800 a ton varieties fall into that category. And that's Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, White Riesling, just to name a few, and Cabernet, as I told you once before, not because it has particularly a small cluster framework, but because it sets a rather loose, a fairly low weight cluster. So if you're going to go into the growing those and spend the money in the coastal county, so forth, for the land you have to pay for, then you should plan to put them on trellis and to cane prune them and make take every effort to get the maximum crop. A third but smaller important reason for this is that cane pruning improves a set with some varieties which give you a poor set, such as Muscat, which I said we long spur in the field, but for home use, or in some countries where they grow Muscat for table fruit, it'd be advantageous to cane prune it and then give a severe flower cluster thinning before bloom in order to get the maximum carbohydrate nutrition to those flower clusters before they bloom. And then finally, one of the big advantages is the same one that applied to cordons, but you not only can spread the fruit out in each direction as you do on cordon, but you can spread it out, if you look at it on top, you can spread it out over several wires. so that you spread it out. Looking down on top now, you can spread them out. Spread the fruit out transversely as well as in this direction, as well as this other direction here to give you good exposure. But what are the disadvantages then of this system? Obviously, there's no cross-cultivation. Obviously, it's an expensive system because of you've got to have an even more complicated trellis than most of the cordon setups that you will use. You have that same problem of a tendency to overcrop because it's sure easy. If you leave one extra spur when you're shooting for 15 or 20, you're only increasing the load by 3 or 4%. But if you leave 5 canes instead of 4, you're increasing the crop by 25% or so. So it's a real easy system to overcrop. And finally, it requires by far the most skill to do a real good job of pruning it properly. You can get that vine out of shape easy by not selecting proper spurs and ones that will produce you your 2 shoots. If you're shooting for 4 canes, you've got to spend some time thinking and selecting and looking at the 4 canes you're going to keep, because if you pick 1 weak cane and leave 3 good ones, you've cut your crop 25%. So that's why it's going to be the last system that you'll work on, which hopefully some of you will get to work on this week.
What was the other variety other than Thompson that you said has sterile?
Oh, good point. And that's Concord. Thompson seedless here and Concord back east. Both have to be cane pruned in order to get a good crop. Well, now comes the part you guys don't like. You're going to get that quiz.